Welcome to another episode of Kidon, War Stories from the Cutting Edge of IP Monetization. My name is David L. Cohen. I am the owner of Kidon IP, a consultancy, and David L. Cohen PC, a law firm, where we provide IP monetization services to clients both large and small. Every episode, I interview other subject matter experts and leaders in the wide world of prosecuting, asserting, analyzing, monetizing, and defending IP rights. You can find this show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and more. Today, my guest is John Geiringer, and we're going to go out a little bit out of my comfort zone, hopefully into John's comfort zone, and talk about what he does. John is an old friend and has an extremely interesting practice and fascinating practice, even if it's not IP. That said, his area of expertise seems to have become even more interesting and timely in the past few days. John is the regulatory section leader of the Financial Institutions Group at Ferrazzano, Kirschbaum, Nagelberg, LLP in Chicago, and concentrates on regulatory governance and investigative matters involving financial institutions. He teaches financial services law at Chicago Kent and also teaches national security law and is the founding co-director of its Center for National Security and Human Rights Law and its Consortium for the Research and Study of Holocaust in the Law. He's the editor of an upcoming book called Countering the Financing of Terrorism, Law and Policy, and the co-editor of an upcoming book involving Holocaust in the law. So, John, like many of us in the law, in the modern practice of law, I should say, you wear many, many hats as a lawyer, forgetting even your personal life. And so, if you had to pick one, what do you say is the primary focus of your practice, at least as it relates to money making or time spent working?
Well, thank you so much, David, for having me. And it's a couple of old friends shooting the bull. It's really an honor to be on your show. So thank you so much. Yeah, I wear, like you said, a bunch of different hats, but my day job, my partner hat now is I'm a recovering bank regulator. Who now works on the other side, in effect. So what I do is in connection with just about anything regulatory that a bank touches is my work. And so that can mean everything from starting a bank to daily operations of a bank, mergers and acquisitions. Unfortunately, 10 years ago, we saw a lot of bank failures, dealing with just about every aspect of public policy you could think of, because they all involve banks, right? Whether it be terrorism finance, cybersecurity, ESG, you name it. Banks have become part of our fabric of our society, and therefore government regulations have really mandated that banks get engaged in public policy. And so, for someone who, was a bank regulator who saw these things on the government side, right. Now in effect, what I get to do is to play ambassador. I talk to the bankers about how the regulators think, and I talk to the bankers about how back and forth to the regulators how the bankers think. Yeah. And so in effect, my role is very similar to that of an ambassador, knowing that at the end of the day, our clients are the banks, and I have to fight for them as hard as I need to. But right. There is a balance. It's not quite the guns blazing kind of litigation that you see in many other areas of law.
Right.
Even when dealing with the government, because sometimes, when dealing with the government, the private sector doesn't worry about their relationship with the government. It's not going to be long lasting. Here, when you're a regulated entity, you have this long-standing relationship with the agency. Right, and so you come in guns blazing and scorched earth, and you could create some serious problems with the relationship.
No, totally, and it undermines the human aspect. And so you're not just dealing with statutes; you're dealing with all different levels of regulation across multiple states, probably, and the federal government. And you're probably also dealing with a huge, having dealt with the bureaucracy of various government agencies in other contexts, you're probably dealing with a huge human element, that sort of the unwritten law that's not even
Well, that's a great way to put it, because as you mentioned, I teach banking law as well, and many of our students are foreign students, and I have to explain our complicated, sometimes anachronistic banking law structure. And, I explain to them that there are statutes, there are regulations, there are interpretations, but then you also have the secret law. And you need to have, and you and I are old enough to know what this is, a very good Rolodex of regulators where you can just pick up the phone and get answers to those questions that lie in the seams between existing law. Because as you can imagine, especially in the context of banks engaging in fintech, financial technology relationships, cryptocurrency, all of these AI, all of these really innovative things, there are great gaps in the law. And so, because the law hasn't caught up to reality, having good relationships with regulators around the country in Washington, D.C., and also good relationships in wearing my other hat with law enforcement, military, and the intelligence communities, even sometimes when we're talking about terrorism issues, it can be really helpful.
No, totally. And so who are your sort of typical day job clients?
Yeah, if there's about 5,000 banks around the country, our sweet spot are mainly the community and regional banks. There's a whole bucket of other banks called SIFIs, significantly important financial institutions, the big banks like they're called.
Mm-hmm.
We do slivers of work for them, but for the most part, we deal with the smaller community banks. And by small, I mean as small as 20 million, which is a very teeny tiny community bank. But also we represent about a little less than 20 publicly traded banks who are, in multi-billion-dollar institutions that can be around the country. And so we do their securities work, their corporate work. I do their regulatory work. Basically, we're a one-stop shop for those banks. And in many ways, sometimes we are their outsourced general counsel.
Got it. And I see, in my little world of IP, there's a pendulum swings on regulation back and forth and what is preferred and whatnot. And it seems to me that sort of the regulatory eye has come again, and small is better and things like that seems to be sort of at least the official mantra, even though that's not necessarily the case in reality. Do you see a trend? There was a trend along, as you mentioned, I think before we started, of consolidation in the banking industry and the mega banks and cross-border mega banks. Do you see a trend in the opposite direction, such that there are going to be more of these smaller and community banks, or your clients, as it were?
Well, what's happened is since I became a banking lawyer 25 or so years ago, there were about 14,000 banks then. We're now down to 5,000. And a lot of that has to do with the consolidation you mentioned. A lot of that has to do, we lost about 500 banks during the last banking crisis. I had expected there'd be a lot more during the COVID crisis, which never happened. And we could talk about that. Strikes me that the PPP program gave enough of a sugar high for banks and their customers to survive the pandemic. But the banking industry continues to consolidate. It loses about 4% a year. And, you can do the math and see where those trend lines are. It used to be the case that when banks merged, their officers would go off and start what are called de novo banks, new banks. But that process has become very cumbersome, time consuming. And so those people now just go out and buy existing banks. So you don't have as much. There are some de novo banks, and we continue to establish. We just established one this year called the Women's Bank. There have been, we've done about 150 de novo banks ourselves. And that was primarily in the 90s and in the O's or the aughts or whatever they're called, whatever that decade is called. We only see a smattering of that right now, even around the country. And so
even with the sort of like the virtual banks, I don't know what they're officially called, but like those entities that allow you to do stuff on your phone, and they don't really seem to have brick and mortar anything anymore. Are those
you'd
new?
be surprised. Even
the
ones that don't seem to have brick and mortar do have some elements of brick and mortar. The regulators are still not very comfortable with internet-only institutions. And you're also grafting old laws on new concepts, right? So you may be familiar with the Community Reinvestment Act. That's from when I was in kindergarten, from 1977. And that was meant to encourage lending, investment, and service in low and moderate income areas within a bank's assessment area. How do you define an assessment area when you are across the country and virtual?
Right.
So, and the regulators are modernizing that framework. And so, coupled with the fact that you've got banks now having these relationships with these fintech companies where they are trying to find ways to be more innovative. When's the last time you went to a bank branch yourself, right? And now everyone has a bank branch right here on your phone. Right. And you can conduct just about anything there. And so, again, like everything else, the regulators quite haven't caught up to the innovation. They're getting better at it. They're getting smarter at it. But, great leaps forward are happening right now. And the government needs to attune themselves to it. I mean, the other thing we're seeing is that, there are political angles to bank regulation. Primarily, we see that in the context.
I'm shocked.
Yeah, shocked, right? I mean, the interesting thing is, for the most part in bank regulation, it is relatively stable, because a lot of these concepts are risk management concepts, like you're not allowed to lend too much to a certain person. You can't have all your eggs in one basket, things like that. You can't have certain relationships with your affiliated organizations, and you can't give sweetheart deals to your officers. So that usually stays the same. But there are elements of the bank regulatory world that you can imagine change with every administration. Right. Fair lending and redlining analysis are clearly one of them.
Right. Those are trendy topics now.
Yeah, and the pendulum has swung probably as much as anyone has seen, right, from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, and so we continue to talk to our clients as to how they need to be nuanced and sensitive to those things, and those issues even bleed into mergers and acquisitions, because in the context of bank M&A, the public are allowed to comment. And the public can say something along the lines of, we think you are not doing well with respect to fair lending.
And the public has been very much invigorated in commenting. I just did my own public comment section with antitrust stuff and patents, and there were hundreds and hundreds of comments that were just shocking, like how many comments in a 2-month period. But some of them are quite detailed. I mean, so I totally see where you're coming from. But speaking of pendulum shifting, it seems that your other area of interest is shifting even faster. So let's talk a little bit about that. So tell us a little bit about your work in national security and human rights law. And first, I guess, what, pre the current craziness, was it mostly academic and public advocacy, or were you actually having private clients and engaging some sort of private law type of activity in that space?
Yeah, good question. I've always been fascinated with national security issues. My folks grew up in Europe and were faced with the issues in World War II. And so I've always been a real history buff, really interested in warfare and things like that. Read everything I could on terrorism. And so I almost went into that field, and I decided, I'm going to come home and be a lawyer and get a real job. And then what wound up happening is, as I mentioned, so many public policy issues affect banks that I was able to find a way to get back into that field and still have that actually help my day job.
Your day job, yeah.
So we go from banking to anti-money laundering to terrorism financing, and then from terrorism financing to national security. And so the contacts I make and the knowledge that I glean from the national security world definitely help me with our clients. So, for example, we do events with our clients where I bring in, for example, the Secret Service to talk about cybersecurity, or I bring in the Department of Justice to talk about cryptocurrency and things like that. So it actually winds up to be very helpful. And that was happening so much that we eventually, myself and a couple others, started a center where I teach. So I teach banking law at Chicago-Kent Law School for about 15 years now. And having had a relationship with the school, a couple of us who are interested in national security started a center there called the Center for National Security and Human Rights Law. And we've got some really neat people involved, people who've prosecuted at the War Crimes Tribunal, people who are Department of Justice terrorism prosecutors, people who've worked in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, as a JAG. And so really fascinating people. We got them all together, and we teach a class on national security law at the school. And we also teach a class on Holocaust and the law. So an element of this National Security Law Center is called CRSHL, the Consortium for Research and Study for Holocaust and the Law. We finally came up with that acronym after some other ones that were a little inappropriate, and I won't mention them on your podcast. We can talk about them later after this.
That's for the adult beverage podcast.
Yeah, exactly. So what we're doing with the center is we have webinars, we have seminars, And we also have a certificate. So we have a cryptocurrency certificate for basically the non-techie type. So we're trying to address every aspect of
that's very trendy stuff. The cybersecurity, I know in IP it's very trendy with respect to trade secret protection and stuff like that. In the trade secret context, you have to show that you've taken reasonable measures for it, in fact, to be a trade secret, which begs the question, what's a reasonable measure in today's day and age? And so you have to show that you've done your cybersecurity diligence. And so it sort of bleeds into a lot of things. So, maybe if you can afterwards, and I'll put it when I post the blog, if you can send some links to the center and the I know some folks who've taken cybersecurity courses online, but a certification might be interesting. So
yeah, and we have one of the folks who's involved in that used to be an Army JAG who led the Army's efforts in both cybersecurity and intelligence. So
wow.
You can imagine the wealth of knowledge he had, and he worked in the private sector with NIST, which is the agency that comes up with some of these standards.
Yeah, I work with standards all the time. I know this.
Yeah, you're used to them, right? But what I'm saying is we have the best of the best who are generating
That's
content
really cool.
along those lines. And then, as I mentioned, that Holocaust and Law Center, what we're doing is we're developing what we think is the first comprehensive curriculum on teaching aspects of Holocaust and the law. And we're not doing it because of our fascination with history, although we do have that, but it's really for lessons for today. So,
is that law during the Holocaust why it was things were illegal, or is that law today like lost property or restitution, things like that, or is it both?
Yeah, it's every aspect of it. So we're going to talk about the war crimes trials, and there were a bunch of them. Both the famous Nuremberg. There was one famous Nuremberg trial, and then 12 more after that. You may have seen the movie Judgment at Nuremberg. That was one of the subsequent trials. That actually was not the main Nuremberg trials.
Right.
And there were domestic trials in Israel and in Germany that people may be familiar with, Demjanjuk. There was also restitution, art restitution, and art restoration and monetary restitution. There were
there was a whole profile the other day about sort of art restitution, not in the context of the Holocaust, but in the context of colonialism or I don't even know what you would call it, because it might even be pre-colonialism, adventurism, stealing stuff from other countries.
Yeah. And every country's done it, right? We all have each other's art. The Holocaust art issue is fascinating, and so that's one element of it. The other thing, as I said, we were going to have a chapter where we talk about lessons for today. So what are some of the things that we should be thinking about in this country? So, for example, there was this concept that Professor Luban at Georgetown talked about called Spielraum, and I speak German. Spielraum is your ability to play around. Some people pejoratively may call it the deep state. Others may say, okay, to the extent you are working for an administration that does things that you think are improper, like the old song says, should I stay or should I go? Mm-hmm. And if I stay, to what extent can I work within the system to blunt the improper or malign aspects of an administration I may be working for? And a lot of this came to head, obviously, in the context of Charlottesville.
Right.
And seeing, what our society is becoming when people can openly say Jews will not replace us, and saying nice things about Hitler and the like. And so a few of us, especially, as I mentioned earlier, myself, I'm a Holocaust survivor's kid, having seen it through my father's eyes, to wonder what kind of society we're becoming. We think that by creating this curriculum on Holocaust and law, it can be very impactful in various arenas, not just in law schools, but with the military, with police, to think about everybody's role in society as to how we should all govern ourselves.
Right. No, there's a lot to talk about there. But in the interest of not spending all day on the podcast, I want to talk about something that's very current. I think we talked about it briefly, but I think the current wave of sanctions against Russia, especially the financial one, seems to be like the perfect combination of all of John Geiringer's interests.
Yeah, that's right. And it's been fascinating to watch. I mean, I've been, as a banking lawyer, I've been thinking about sanctions since I started. sanctions, you may be aware, are administered here in this country through the Treasury Department. It's called the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which has been doing this stuff for a very long time. There's some fascinating stories about, World War II and earlier, how we've used economic sanctions as a tool of our government, part of the many tools in the toolkit, non-kinetic. So, not the same kinds of issues when you're actually putting boots on the ground. But it's been, depending on who you ask, it's been an effective part of many tools with respect to countries like North Korea and Iran and unplugging them from the banking system. And now, with respect to Russia, and some of these sanctions have been in place since Crimea, since 2014, and the ratcheting up over the last week has been really incredible to see, and taking them out of the SWIFT network and these various things where you can cause.
It seems to have caused across almost a Rubicon here. Sort of to bring an analogy from national security, it's like we set off a controlled nuclear. We set off a Hiroshima. There might still be a Nagasaki. I forget which one came first, but was that right? Yeah, right. So and there might be a Nagasaki, but now what? Like after Nagasaki, now what? Like, do we have mutually assured destruction? Do we have some sort of SALT treaty? Like, what do we do? Like, so we're not doing that.
Yeah, this is like if you watch the movie Spinal Tap. If you're already at 10, can you go to 11 on the amplifier, right? And so I think there still is room. There's still other sanctions to do. We haven't yet sanctioned Putin himself. We've certainly sanctioned his cronies. We've decoupled Russia, in effect from the international banking system. That there are still ways around it, just because he's off of SWIFT. Which is really just a messaging system for more fluid transfers. There are other ways to get around it. He's got relationships with China where they're developing
which points to a weakness in the fundamental thing. The more you escalate the economic sanctions, especially like when you're dealing with North Korea, it's one thing, but you're dealing with the 11th largest country in the world, and you're dealing with the economy in the world, and the second largest economy in the world, China. I think it's the second, right?
Yeah, I think we're 20 trillion. I think they're 15 or so.
Right, and so and they're highly incentivized to decouple from us anyway currently. So if you're creating these incentives, if they decouple, you sort of undermine the strength of sanctions.
Well, and you undermine our ability, right? Dollar-based transactions have historically been the way to do things, and you're absolutely right. When you hear people saying, "Why isn't Biden taking the maximalist approach from the beginning?" I think it's that concern over blowback. I mean, the more we use some of the stronger tools in our arsenal, the more other actors will work around them. And therefore, that'll cut off our ability in future events to be able to use sanctions as an effective tool. So that's exactly right. And that's why I think there's some reticence of going to, if we can use Spinal Tap, going up to 11.
Right.
Unless we really think we need to. Now, this is, the greatest land war in Europe since World War II. I think we're at the point where we're just about at 11. There are a few tools left on the sanctions front. And then beyond, once you've done everything you can on the sanctions front, some of these things take time to work.
Take time to have impact, right?
Yeah, some things happen instantly. Some things take time. Some of these restrictions being put on international flights in Russia and export controls being placed on, their ability to get
components for military hardware. I think they're still heavily dependent on a lot of components from the West.
That's right. Not even military hardware, but just their planes, right? How are they going to get their planes serviced and things like that? So in effect, creating an environment where they can't fly outside of their own country.
Right.
So between the economic sanctions and the export controls, it really puts a lot of pressure on them. And, you're seeing these brave men and women in the streets who know that they could be arrested or sent to the front just for protesting, and yet they're doing it.
Right.
I'll leave to the experts on how much pressure that can put on Putin. But I did go back recently and started refreshing myself on how the Soviet Union died. Mm-hmm. And if you go back to that and you see those cracks were formed by those public, those brave public protests, and whether that impacts the oligarchs, how that impacts Putin's inner circle, whether they would ever feel like they can do an Operation Valkyrie like they tried to do against Hitler. I think the more pressure that's put to bear, the more those thoughts come to light.
And I think there's two issues that sort of concern me, because the Ukraine thing is the Ukraine situation is very tragic on many levels. But what has me concerned, I guess, is you've taken a lot of stuff out of the bag that are now, like, it's once you use a weapon, it's like less and less, fewer and fewer speed bumps to using it again. And so but I think there's sort of two levels of the weapons used that we're talking about. There's sort of country level, and then there's individual level. You mentioned the oligarchs, right? And so on a countrywide level, I'm very concerned that this not becomes sort of like the usual play. And like, you have a disagreement, and then you go to 11 immediately. And so do you sort of see some sort of process coming out, or do you hear anything about some sort of process where people are going to create these sort of rules of the road on how to use these sanctions going forward?
I think those 10 or 11 or even 8 or 9 sanctions have only been used and calibrated, I think, very intentionally. So, they've been used, obviously, the biggest ones have been used against North Korea and Iran, which are really, obviously two of the more problematic countries on
right.
On the international stage. And so I think we try to be mindful of those blowback issues. What's been interesting to me is to see the extent to which we are finally getting better and smarter about winning the informational war against Russia. For years, those of us who've been following it have seen how Russia has used active measures and infiltrated our politics. Right. And, our country has gotten a lot better, and Biden's use of declassifying intelligence that we thought we'd never see and open source intelligence sources on the ground have created this really interesting environment where we are now going more on the offensive on the informational front. So, for example, that we were able to say Russia's probably going to engage in these false flag operations where they're going to stage a pretend explosion in Russia that ostensibly were caused by Ukrainians and things like that. And it really took away their weapon. And it almost seemed that it took away the element of surprise and their own timeline for doing this. It seemed to put them off guard because we're not used to declassifying that information. The problem with declassifying it is, do we blow sources and methods?
Blow sources and exactly. But moving to sort of the other side of it, which is the individualized side. I think I mentioned before we started, the DOJ opened up today, announced today. What are they? I keep blanking on the name. As the klepto capture task force that they're going to organize with a whole bunch of other countries. And one of the, again, bar stool or pub stool in England complaints that people make about, the world today has been the inundation of the capitals of a lot of European countries and the States with oligarch money, buying up all the properties and hiding behind all these shell games. And there's a whole neighborhood near Westminster, the capital in London, that's basically just oligarch homes. I mean, that's what they all say they are. No one can quite figure it out whose it is. And it seems to be like a whole movement now to sort of know your client type of laws across the board that could really, really change the landscape. What do you see coming down the line there? And how do you think that'll probably impact your clients or sort of small to mid-sized businesses generally?
Yeah, I think a little history here is important. In 1999, the bank regulators came out with a proposed regulation demanding that banks, quote unquote, know your customer.
Right.
The banks all complained. They said, we don't want to be Big Brother. We don't want to be in this business. That's your job. And then 9/11 happened, and everyone got on board. They rebranded Know Your Customer to Customer Identification Program. And that was the case for a while. And then there's an international organization called FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which actually gives grades for every country as to their anti-money laundering regime. They graded us poorly because what we weren't doing is ascertaining the beneficial ownership behind some of these smaller LLCs and the like. And so just like you and I probably both crammed for our finals, right before America was going to get its next exam from FATF 10 years later, we wrote a rules capturing that beneficial ownership information, requiring banks to say, who is the owner, the 25% owners, or who is the management official. Well, just recently in last year, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, which is a sister agency to OFAC, was tasked with actually creating a database. So now it's no longer going to be banks that have to obtain that information, but it's going to have to be those shell companies and other companies as well that need to provide that information to FinCEN. So it'll be FinCEN responsible for collecting the information, disseminating the information, creating transparency around who owns and who controls some of these companies that have been used to engage in money laundering, terrorism financing, and the like.
Yeah, well, it's not just money laundering and terrorism financing. A lot of it is hiding. I mean, it was in the Panama Papers, and there was another one that I forget what it's called. A lot of wealthy individuals have offshored their assets, whether it's to tax avoidance schemes that may or may not be perfectly legal, or just for anonymity. I can't pronounce that word. To remain anonymous.
Anonymity.
Yeah, that's the word. It's a New York accent. So where do you see that happening? Do you see sort of a trend towards greater transparency, that it's going to be harder to hide your assets? Especially, there's the U.S. also, but especially, in other countries, to the extent you can speak to that, they often don't require you to give global reporting of your non-domestic assets. And you sort of have the situation where you can be very, squeaky clean in the UK, but God knows what the hell you own elsewhere because it's not relevant to the tax authorities.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're going to see, we have been seeing, is the Panama Papers and similar leaks. What they did is they basically disseminated that information to news outlets in the different countries, so that it wasn't like WikiLeaks where they just threw out the raw data. That they actually provided the information to each country, so and that each of those countries knew who those players were and were able to do a deep dive and write stories. Hundreds of reporters delving through this information, and so I think to some extent that's going to be the wave of the future. Through again, we always complain about leaks, and there's some leaks that ostensibly, depending on which side of it you are, has some more benign attributes to it. In this case, it's outing, in effect, those who are cheating the system, skirting the system, doing nefarious things, allegedly. And in that context, I would expect that through the DOJ's new program.
Klepto capture. Now I got it.
Klepto capture program is, I would assume that they are mining that information that's out there in the public to see where the Russian oligarchs have parked their money, and will go through methodically to capture that.
Do you see more international cooperation, or do you have any international cooperation on your day-to-day?
Yeah, I don't see that in my day-to-day, because mainly we're working with the community and regional banks. I am following it, obviously, like many people are, to see, it's amazing to see Switzerland getting on board with some of these.
Seriously.
Right. I mean, they were neutral with respect to the Nazis, and yet they have picked a side with respect to Putin, which is, fascinating history on both accounts. But no, it has been interesting to see the way in which Putin has really re-energized NATO, re-energized those nations who believe in the rule of law. And I think even if I'm sitting in Putin's cabinet, I'm thinking all of this is counterproductive, because our athletes can't compete on the world stage. We're being shut out in a way that I think will be hard for countries to forget about. The ways in which Russia has acted on the world stage. We can start with the Olympics and world sports, and how they consistently seem to be popping up in doping scandals and things like that. And I think the world has just seen, maybe we should take stronger steps here across the board against their malign activities. I mean, you see, there have been folks who have been complaining about Putin since 2000, or complaining about, I mean, this isn't Putin's first rodeo with
No, for
respect
sure.
to, what he's done in Chechnya, what he's done in Estonia, what he's done in other countries. And so in Georgia, obviously, and then Crimea in 2014, this is him. I mean, no one should be surprised by these actions.
No, for sure, for sure.
This may be his last rodeo. He's turning 70, and maybe he wants to do one last shot.
Go out with well, let's hope he doesn't go out with a bang.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's looking long term. The short term sanctions on his country, unless he gets deposed, he's thinking about, in 100 years, will the historians write a book that he reunited?
Great. Yeah, right. But so turning a little bit more practical. So I advise a lot of small companies. Some of them are LLCs, and they try to hide beneficial ownership of patents because they don't want people to know right away. I mean, they'll tell the courts, but they don't want it to be public and whatnot. But just sort of turning it backwards. Now that we've talked about the grand strategy and the grand scope of things, how do you see? Well, I imagine the answer is not much in the short run, but how do you see all of these chess pieces moving on the sanctions stage and the geopolitical stage, impacting the compliance requirements for small to mid-sized companies and banks, including banks?
And don't forget, when I mentioned OFAC, and I mainly deal with in the context of financial institutions, but I also advise other clients on dealing with OFAC, because everybody in the United States needs to deal with OFAC. And even foreign companies that have American presence, they need to deal with OFAC. OFAC has some significant ability to impose civil money penalties.
Can you spell the acronym again for our listeners?
Sorry, OFAC. It's the Office of Foreign Assets, and that's plural, Assets Control, Office of Foreign Assets Control. And they actually have a guidebook that talks about compliance that they really expect everyone to do, not just highly regulated institutions like banks. And so what I would encourage your listeners and your clients to think about is how OFAC can impact them, particularly when we're dealing with, Russian and Ukrainian type sanctions. Because, for example, OFAC has a list called the SDN list. It's a specially designated national list. That's a list of individuals and entities with whom and with which you need to block and freeze their accounts. But OFAC has this other insidious rule that says it's not just whomever on that public list, but any 50% subsidiaries of that list. And guess what? That 50% list doesn't exist. So the government doesn't tell you who they are. You are, in effect, expected to either figure out yourselves or hire a third party to figure out yourselves. Right. And I've talked to some of these companies who do it, and they, not just figuratively, they literally hire former Russian rocket scientists to pore over documents in Russia to figure out who the 50% subsidiaries are of some of those sanctioned entities on the OFAC list. That wasn't an issue when we were sanctioning terrorists because they were living in a cave. But when you have Russian banks and Russian entities that have very complex subsidiary institutions as part of their organization, that becomes very daunting. And
I imagine that also will be impacting on the export control list, because I know in the context of in patent litigation, for example, if you're doing document review, export control becomes a very big issue because you can't allow third-party vendors who may or may not be in the United States and may or may not be citizens of countries that are, on the kosher side of the export control list, review documents, technical documents. And it becomes
that's right. And then you have some of these that are dual use, right? Where you think, this doesn't feel like a military object that's restricted, but they are. Mm-hmm. And so between that and Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and things like that, it's really important to know who is in your ecosystem and what not just what your compliance regime is, but what theirs is.
Right. So, John, how do our folks get in touch with you if they want to learn more about you and your practice?
Well, thanks for asking. Yeah, all my information is on our firm's website, bfkn.com. B as in boy, F as in Frank, K as in kilo, N as in November, and you can just look up my name. All my info is there. And then we also have a website for our Center for National Security Human Rights Law, and within that is that crucial hyperlink as well, where for those who are interested in resources, either in national security law or Holocaust and law issues, we've got plenty of great free resources that are there. Be happy to chat with anyone. And this has been a real blast.
This has been great. Thank you so much, John. And thank you, everyone, for listening.